Good morning and good afternoon to everyone who's listening. Thank you for joining us today. I'm delighted today to present this exciting panel on climate priorities for 2021. I'm joined today by Melanie Nakagawa, Special Advisor to President Biden on the National Security Council, Special Advisor for Climate, and also Tracy McKibben, of founder and CEO of Mac Energy Advisors. Thank you both very much for joining me here today. Melanie, perhaps I could start with you. You, of course, must have had an incredible couple of weeks gearing up for last week's announcements from the White House on the big emissions plan, an announcement that, of course, was incredibly welcomed by the rest of the world. But, of course, the international community have been very much scarred by the last 4 years of what we heard from the Trump administration in terms of turning away from Paris. How can you convince skeptical listeners, perhaps, that this time is different, that the U.S. really is back at the table?
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for that question. I think a lot has changed, and you're right. We are coming from a place of humility and being humble about how we're trying to get back. And that's why the president on day one made his announcement to rejoin the Paris Agreement and made this commitment that within the first 100 days, he would accelerate U.S. action both at home and abroad on climate change. And part of that fulfillment of that goal and that campaign promise was to host a world gathering of leaders, particularly around major economies and major emitters who are responsible for about 80% of global emissions and also have 80% of the global GDP, and they represent that. And so this leader summit that happened over the last week, it was last Thursday and Friday, starting on Earth Day, was really a signal of what it means for America to be back. There are three key outcomes that came out of the summit that I think should give the international community some confidence and a bit more confidence in where the U.S. is when it comes to rejoining Paris and being back at the table on international climate engagement. The first was, as you mentioned, the announcement of our nationally determined contribution target. But that target was really based off of a large efforts of domestic efforts, whether it's in transportation, power sector, industrial, and all those pieces culminated and add up to not only job creation at home, but that 50 to 52% reduction by 2030 as a U.S. target. But that's really made up of actions and it's built upon actions that have been happening for the last several years, not just in the last 100 days. And that's a key part about that durability. Another key piece was the financial elements to the summit. The U.S. not only announced a doubling of international climate finance, and particularly a tripling of the adaptation amount by 2024, but that from the Obama years of the highest peak of Obama years. But frankly, around the finance piece, it was also about blended finance. It was about bringing the private sector. And this conversation today and at the Bloomberg Summit is really about the role of both public and private finance. And the summit was a real showcase of that. We had a panel focused around what the banks were doing, about the trillions that are shifted towards climate aligned strategies, the focus around disclosure, the focus around net zero banking, and really how we work with the US government. The U.S. Development Finance Corporation, a key vehicle for leveraging private capital and getting them to the table, particularly in hard to access areas and developing economies. They made a pretty significant announcement, which was to get net zero by 2040. That would put the U.S. ahead of the other G7, G20 development finance institutions. And that's another key piece, again, about the durability of our U.S. commitment, is that these are financial commitments we're making that are more long-term and longer sighted. And the last key piece was, I think what I'm really excited to share is the whole of government approach the U.S. is bringing to the table this time around than in previous years. We had over a dozen cabinet officials all hosting sessions or discussing on panels what they see their role is in terms of driving climate action forward from the U.S. administration, from the Biden administration. This means it's not just one silo or one area or one opportunity, but it's really about an entire administration who's all looking at different components of the climate solution, which we all know has to be economy-wide and solved economy-wide. Each of them took a role in the summit to showcase their leadership and what they're going to do over the next 4 years. And I think those elements, when you combine them together, should give confidence to the international community that we have a durable plan, we have a durable platform, and we're really here to really focus on how do we bring others to the table with us.
So could you talk to us a little bit about the sort of the concrete steps that the administration is going to take to enact some of these policies and some of these ideas? I think the administration has talked about a lot of executive orders. Could you talk to us a little bit about what kind of executive orders we might see here, and in fact, what policies you could imagine perhaps needing congressional passing to get through?
Sure, there's two places. There's a domestic and international component. I'll start with the international component, which is really about what are we doing to make sure that the U.S. represents around 15% of global emissions. A key part of the emissions pie, let's not, I'm not trying to belittle that by any means, but the 85% is obviously a significant portion. And so at least from my position on the national security side, one of the key ways we're doing that is actually not through executive order per se. It's about how do we make climate change an essential element of our foreign policy and national security. And I'm happy to say in the first 100 days, that plan is already bearing fruit. So the president in almost nearly all of his engagements has raised climate change with all of his counterparts and world leaders in each of those calls. The effect of that was not only did he raise an initial call with the Canadians or the Mexicans or other countries, but then it was followed up with additional follow-up, whether it was a working group or a joint statement, or in the first bilateral meeting with the Canadians or with the Mexicans. You see climate elevated on the agenda. You see it elevated in something called the Quad, which is India, Japan, Australia, and the US. We also had an output of that conversation at the leader level was climate change. And so it's really about building up these habits of cooperation. It's not about one moment or one time, but the fact that internationally speaking with the other 85% of emissions, we're going to be coming to the table every time, each time, to think about how are we working together to accelerate technology development, innovation, finance, and help those countries increase their ambition. Regarding your domestic story, your domestic question, yes, there's areas of executive order. There's working with Congress on a clean power, a clean energy standard for the power sector to reach those goals. It's working with mayors and governors and the subnational players that often have a lot of ability to address the emissions from their particular region or particular area, and making sure we're working with them. And that was how we developed our 50 to 52% target, was working with a range of stakeholders to ensure that we could get this done not only in Congress, but also at the states and the local areas where, frankly, a lot of these emissions and a lot of the work we need to be working with together to get it done.
And you talked about clean energy and clean tech, and I have one further question on that before I bring in Tracy. There was a summary sheet that the White House put out last week along with the announcement, I think citing the IAE, that said about 45% of the emissions cuts envisioned in the Biden plan rely on clean technology, green technologies that are not yet commercially viable. Could you talk to us a little bit? You, of course, have a background in clean energy. What do you personally see as maybe the 2 or 3 most promising areas of green technology where perhaps they're not quite where they need to be yet, but where investors and Bloomberg readers and viewers should be looking at over the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, we know we need to decarbonize everything if we're going to get to the net zero by 2050 target. But I'll say, in terms of, for my own personal view, I would say the 3 sort of core sectors that I think are most promising and interesting, and where there actually are some technologies, it just needs maybe more R&D. And the U.S. actually, under this administration, is committed to increasing our R&D share to really help accelerate those technologies. But I'll say in the power sector, I'll start there, which is a major part of what we talked about last week. Power sector, long duration energy storage, digital technologies for smart grids, and how do you actually get the clean energy technologies, which we're working with countries around the world, countries that have 50% renewable energy targets, 35% renewable targets. We know they're going to need a smarter grid to be able to balance that power and balance that load. And so those solutions there are really interesting. In transport, the president made a commitment of 500,000 EV charging stations in the US alone. But globally, we're seeing a massive demand for EV charging infrastructure and EVs writ large. So whether it's clean fuels for trucks, for cars, for planes, for shipping. I think the decarbonization of transport is an area where there's some new breakthroughs that have yet to be discovered, particularly in the clean fuels space. But there's also technologies that are right there on the cusp and ready to accelerate. And the last area that I'm particularly excited about is in the agriculture sector. I think there's a lot of opportunities within oceans or nature-based solutions and technologies there, which still are more in the adaptation lane, which, as I mentioned, hasn't always been a prime top recipient for investment and investors' attention. But I think there's a real movement afoot now where we're looking at regenerative agriculture and different types of agriculture solutions that are needed here at home, but frankly also overseas. And so we could lead at home and export those solutions abroad that I think will make America a real leader in this space.
Thank you. So Tracy, I'd like to bring you in on that. You are a founder and CEO of Mac Energy Advisors. You provide investment and consultancy services in the green tech, clean tech area. Before I ask you to sort of, for your response or your thoughts on the Biden plan, could you also maybe address that question? What do you see as maybe the 2 or 3 or 4 most promising areas of green technology over the next decade or so, which of course will be very crucial to enacting the Biden plan.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm in agreement with Melanie in some of the areas that she laid out, because I sort of look at the 4 key areas that I think will have the most potential to impact the task and the goals that have been set, and that's transportation, buildings, power, and energy. Melanie mentioned agriculture. I do think that's very important, and it's often not focused on enough. But in the transportation areas, we know a significant amount of the greenhouse gas emissions come from transportation. I think it's around 30%. You've had a number of states who've tried to address that. The Biden administration, I was very excited to see their $15 billion commitment to installing EV charging stations. So there's the charging stations, as well as getting auto manufacturers who are setting commitments around their goal of further adoption of EV vehicles across the nation. Battery technology is what I see over the last year. While you might have thought the pandemic slowed things down, there's been so much interest and focus on creating new battery technology. As you know, the top 4 battery technology companies, only one is in the U.S. So building up that capacity in the U.S. is an area that I see a number of companies focusing on new advanced battery technology. I saw, around the building area, focus on energy efficiency, how you're retrofitting buildings. I think a lot of companies are focused on what they can offer from a technology perspective to create those efficiencies, whether it's in the construction area, the kind of material, how you're making concrete. Concrete and steel, as you know, are sort of big areas of focus around emissions. Lighting is also, I think, will make a significant impact. And the power sector, you see a lot of utilities are trying to figure out how they can build in decarbonization as part of their strategic plan. The power sector will play a key role in whether that's all the different renewables, solar, wind, hydropower, geothermal, even clean hydrogen is an area that you will see a lot of focus. And that will have to be combined with energy storage. So you build reliance and resiliency in that. And so you see a number of utilities sort of adopting and expanding their investment in renewable energy. And then on the energy side, as I say, what's happening in the oil and gas sector, to address sort of the challenge you have around decarbonization, it will take a significant amount of investment in carbon capture and storage. And so you see a number of companies that are seeing that as an opportunity for their growth and increased revenue streams about how do you take that carbon and bury it in the ground. So that's an area that I think you will see lots of focus on creating and investing in technology and research and development around that. Clean fuels is another area, hydrogen. I started out in my investment career focused on biofuels, and I think there's certainly room for continued attention and support from a technology and a financial perspective in that area. And then, as I said, Melanie mentioned agriculture. I do think that does need more attention, because I think there's lots of opportunities in terms of how water feeds into our agriculture. And water itself is another area of investment that I think has an impact on the climate as well.
Which of these would you say is the toughest? There's lots of moonshots, of course, here that we're talking about. Do you think it's fair to say that carbon capture is the one that sort of feels obviously the most interesting and could have the most impact, but people have, of course, been talking about that for a long time, and no one has yet brought a commercially viable form of carbon capture to the table. Is that the toughest, do you think, to achieve of all of these?
So I will start with saying people have been talking about this for a long time. I actually served in a prior administration back in 2004, and we were talking about carbon capture and storage. And so it is very expensive. And so it will require that kind of private-public partnership that Melanie referred to. I think the government can take the kind of risk that perhaps the private sector isn't, ready and able to take. So there's definitely needed financial support from the government, but it will take private sector participation to drive this forward. But I do think that's probably the most difficult. It's an area that there have been many looking at ways to break through and have a more significant impact. I do think it's there. Like, again, I have a sober but optimistic view about our ability to address some of these concerns.
So speaking of sober and optimistic, could I ask you for a sober assessment of the Biden administration's announcements from last week? Maybe if which areas do you find most encouraging, but also where would you like the administration to be doing more, and where do they need to do more?
So I think the most important thing that I'm optimistic about is sending the right signal. While there certainly have been investments over the years, even when you didn't get the government signal or that you wanted, companies were still moving forward. Many companies saw this as an opportunity for growth for them. But I think getting the signals right helps the private sector, pivot in the direction that you ultimately want them to go, which is focus on a low carbon economy. And so I'm excited that the signals are being set, that there are goals that are being set. But the hard part is turning those goals into actual executing on those goals. And I think, it will require things like legislation. I think Melanie referred to the clean energy standard. I think that will be very necessary. You see that as how Europe has driven a lot of their growth in the low carbon technologies. Passing laws that will make these kinds of standards mandatory. Carbon pricing is another area that is quite controversial about how you can send the right signal because I do think there exists a shadow carbon pricing already. As you've seen how companies have been making investments. And so making that from a national federal perspective so that you can so that companies can make the right decisions they need to make. They need to make long-term decisions. And so when you've got legislation as opposed to executive orders, even though legislation can be changed, it sends a more permanent signal for that. And then I think other kinds of incentives like tax credits, whether it's renewable energy tax credits, affordable housing tax credits. I think expanding on those is another area that I'd like to see the administration focus on. So those are some of the things that I think that will help companies make the right kinds of decisions they have, and also if I could just say from a company perspective, helping them to be more transparent about where their carbon footprint is, where their emission levels are. And I think as the private sector continues to drive those kinds of technology to help measure that, I think that will also be helpful. And the government can help in supporting financially the development of those kinds of technologies.
Thank you. So we're now going to show a poll that we conducted of Bloomberg Green readers and summit participants that sort of asked people what sector do they think is the most important in the battle against climate. And I personally found the results somewhat surprising. We see 23% talking about business, 28% talking about government, but only 7% rated finance as being the most important area when it comes to the climate fight. Melanie, perhaps I could turn to you. You talked about, both you and Tracy have talked about the importance of financing. Does that surprise you? Does that number seem quite low to you, given the importance of green financing in the climate fight?
It's surprising, especially given the audience that it was asked to, which I believe is mostly made up of the financial sector. So I don't know if it's a finger-pointing exercise or something else, but it is surprising because it is a key. I would have thought it'd been a third, or sort of go more towards all of the above. So it is a surprising figure at the end, unless they thought that the financial industry, they conflated it with businesses and thought that there was that angle there to it. But no, it is a surprising result because it is a key part. It's a key part because the finance industry as a whole is a key part of financing the solution and shifting the investment towards the clean energy and climate tech opportunities. And the ranges are everywhere from PitchBook to, you name it, upwards of trillions of dollars that are going to be invested into the climate tech space by 2025, based on these market signals that Tracy just talked about. And so I think it is a key part of the solution, in addition to the government signals, coupled with the business opportunities to receive that finance, and then the financial industry it's all of the above, because all three pieces of those pillars need to work together. And if you really were to do a look back of the various climate tech or clean tech booms starting in 1.0 all the way to, some call this 3.0, you'll see that you had one of the pillars or two of the pillars, but not all three moving in the same direction. And today, I really feel like we're at a moment in time where you have the financial industry aligned. I heard, Larry Fink's comments earlier in the summit and others that spoke prior to me in the summit that's happening today talk about the role that the financial players are playing, that it's shifted, that the ball's rolling downhill in terms of where the momentum is in terms of climate aligned strategies. And then you've got the political winds all aligned right now with the new Biden administration, coupled with what's happening out of Europe and Canada. You look around at the summit, we had 40 world leaders that voluntarily showed up at all various call times, because it was a virtual summit that was live, to voluntarily come to the platform to talk about what they are going to do to raise ambition on climate change. And I think that's a very significant announcement that was made, to have all of them show up at last week. And then you've also got, so you got politics, you got finance, and then you've got the technology/businesses. While you do state that, we still have, maybe 40-something% of the technology yet to be created, that's overlooking the fact that what we actually have today that's deployable, things that Tracy's investing in and others that are ready to scale and scale quickly, and some that are already commercially viable as costs continue to decline. So that's just my quick reaction to that poll. So thanks.
Yeah. And very, very quickly, speaking of financial markets, because we are running short of time, if you compare the European sort of policy approach to this versus the US one thing that was noticeably missing from the Biden plan last week was carbon trading and carbon pricing. Could you talk a little bit about why that's not as central a part of the framework in the U.S. approach compared to Europe, and could we expect more of that in the future down the line in the Biden administration?
Well, there's different ways to approach it. I'm a bit biased. I had worked in a previous time on cap and trade policy in the United States. And so there's different ways to approach how we're going to send the right market signal. We're starting with, we have a more fulsome climate action plan that we'll give details about later this year, not yet quite now. But we've got various, I guess I think about it as Lego building blocks or Lego bricks, and they all add up. And so this is the first part of those Lego building blocks in terms of how we're going to be addressing climate change. It's through the American Jobs Plan. It's through a variety of different types of tax credits and incentives that Tracy talked about. It's through the Loan Program Office and others. And so I think there's various components that all will culminate into a broader action plan, but we've got these different pieces and we're only 100 days in. So give us some time.
You've got some time. So this is, of course, part of our New Voices series, and one of the things I want to talk about before we wrap up is diversity of voices, diversity of opinions in the climate debate. And to kick us off, I think we have a video question from a member of the Green community, and I think that's directed towards Melanie. I think we'll hear the question now.
Hello. I'm Glenda D. Hawthorne, the founder and owner of Tate Hawthorne Enterprises. My question is for Melanie Nakagawa. Ms. Nakagawa, will the president take into account the ecological consequences of any infrastructure developments? We know from past experience the folly in not doing so. Thank you.
Melanie, please.
Great. Well, thank you. My remit is not the domestic agenda, but I will say that we're absolutely committed to environmental protection, especially on the domestic infrastructure side. And then we are definitely applying that on the overseas work as well. Our climate finance plan talks about how we want to invest in projects and opportunities overseas that are climate aligned, and we will obviously apply the best environmental practices to it.
Tracy, do you want to come in on that as well? Because of course, infrastructure plans and green infrastructure plans can sort of, obviously can further the climate agenda. But of course, there are many, many stakeholders in these conversations, environmental stakeholders, ecological stakeholders. Do you want to can you talk a little bit about how you think we can bring more of those different kinds of voices and perspectives into the broader climate debate?
So I think it's an important question because, you have communities that are most impacted by climate change are the least capable of responding and reducing that impact. And so being able to make sure that you're talking with local communities about, as we look, I think from my perspective, when you're siting a renewable energy project. It's not only just about the siting and permitting, it is the location and the geography of that project, and making sure that we're not only being comprehensive in how we address climate change, but also being fair about the impact, because it needs to be equitable for workers and states, but also communities. Again, because those communities that are most impacted are often least capable of dealing with it. And so, as we look at it, there are a number of disruptions that can occur. Food security being one. Not only just sort of flooding and fires and hurricanes and heat. And so, making sure that we're taking a holistic approach about the communities that are most impacted by climate change, and making sure that they're part of the dialogue. This is, local communities, businesses, governments all need to work together to make sure that we're building and addressing and meeting the challenge around lowering emissions and building a low carbon economy.
So we're pretty close to wrapping up. I've taken a sort of a slightly meandering route to the key question in this panel, your climate priorities for 2021. I mean, Melanie, obviously a lot of work has gone into the first 100 days, an incredible amount of work I'm sure went into last week. But can you give us maybe your two priorities that you see now as your most important, now that the initial phase is over, the announcement is out, and now I guess it's it's time to get down to enacting it?
Exactly. Now is when the hard work begins, so they say. So the next priority for us is twofold. The first is getting to work on implementing our commitments. I mean, exactly as you started off at the top of the panel, how do we show that we're here and that we are building meaningful commitments, is to start to actually implement those. And so really looking forward to not only following up with many of our bilateral partners that showed up with action last week, whether it's Canada that announced their ambitious new target, or the Japanese that announced their up to 50%, 46 to 50% nationally determined contribution, and then about a dozen other countries that have all announced a commitment to commit by the climate conference in November, the so-called COP26, that they will themselves put out their stronger target. So really the next few weeks and months up until November is really about how do we work with all of these countries to start to demonstrate that they're putting together a roadmap of action in the 2020s. This is truly the decisive decade. While net zero by 2050 is a really important target, somebody once said, 2030 is the new 2050, and I couldn't believe that. I couldn't foot stomp that more. This next decade of action is really critical, and so we're really now starting to work with all of these key countries, and everyone from the Seychelles that announced an ocean-related effort into their nationally determined contribution, to the large emitters. To Tracy's point, it's really about working with all countries, the big and the small, to really work with them to help them get their climate action ready for the climate conference later this year. And the other key priority is going to be about how do we mobilize all the different key players within the U.S. government that can bring those tools to bear. We have a really strong EPA with regulations and policies that they can share best practice with other partners, a Treasury that's that's really kind of reinvigorated on the climate agenda around climate risk and transparency, and an SEC. So really being able to harness all those great voices and bring those overseas to share what we're doing, best practice, and frankly, technical support to help everyone else get to Glasgow to keep 1.5 degrees Celsius alive.
Thank you. And Tracy, I'll give you the final word. Your two priorities for, coming out of the Screen Festival and for the rest of the year.
I'd say it's consistent with what Melanie has said. For me, it's focusing on scaling up solutions. As we scale up our investments in specific renewable energy plants, solar, wind, geothermal, as well as scaling up our investments in technologies. Battery technology is where we're focused this year, both in terms of transportation as well as support for renewable energy plants. And so those are the two areas that we're focused on. But again, it's all about scaling up solutions, taking advantage of the technology innovation that we have here in the U.S.